My story today brings me to the old medieval town of Biggar. It's the 23rd of February, 1303, and John Comyn arrives here with a force of armed men. He meets up with Simon Fraser, and together they join their forces. They've received intelligence about English movement. A force under the command of Sir John de Segrave, Edward the First Lieutenant in Scotland, is moving north. They make a night march by following the old Roman road through Dolphinton, West Linton, the village of Carlops, down through Glencorse. Their objective: to engage the enemy on the fields beside a small, quaint village called Roslin. In a rout of legendary skirmishes, they would defeat an English army in what would come to be known as the Battle of Roslin. This is the monument dedicated to the Battle of Roslin in 1303. What was Scotland like at that time? In November 1302, a truce had just ended. The English were expecting a resurgence of opposition in the north, and they sent Sir John de Segrave at the head of an English force to hold the territory, support the garrisons, and hold the lines, as it were. Now, the myths tell us that John de Segrave was in love. He had a love affair with Margaret Ramsay of Dalhousie, or Dalwolsey, who didn't exist. Henry Sinclair was also involved. The reality of the situation was that Scottish castles were being attacked and taken. Supply wagons were being attacked. William Wallace was back in the country now. Whether he was present or not, we really do not know. We only have Harry's account for that. But they were sent to support the garrons. They were quick, effective, and mobile units. Fordun and Bower have the numbers at 30,000 English soldiers against around 8,000 Scots. No one sends an army that size up in February. Edward I was already planning a campaign in May that year. It takes time to summon an army like that. These forces, Sir John de Segrave commanding, Edward I Lieutenant in Scotland, were designed to support the garrisons and hold the occupied territory. John Comyn and Simon Fraser got wind of this, and they made a forced march from Biggar overnight, somewhere over there. And we're going to look at specifically where tradition says the battle or series of battles happened. Comyn and Fraser fell upon them in the early hours in an unexpected attack. It's generally believed that the English army were in 3 separate brigades, 3 divisions. And they came here. They camped in different places, but very close to each other. High command was Sir John de Segrave. The other was Ralph Manton. In the 3rd Division, commanded by Sir Robert Neville or William Latimer. This is Shinbanes Field. Shinbanes traditionally gets its name from reports of bones being dug up from the battle. And this is where I believe de Segrave made camp, and he was attacked here in the early hours of the morning. Now, John Comyn and Simon Fraser would have come from that way. Glencorse, lying at the foot of the Pentland Hills. This is quite a large area. When you look down there, we have the woods and what is known as the Kilburn or the Kilburn, and we'll speak about that in due course. This is the lower Shinbanes field, and as you can see, the field dips down here towards the woodland. It's very possible here that there were 2 camps. It's certainly large enough, depending on what numbers you believe, and I will commit to what numbers I think that the Scots and the English had in relation to this battle. Now, when the Scots attacked them, it was in the early hours of the morning. I don't believe that Sir John de Segrave suspected any hostile presence at all. The camp was caught unawares. I believe de Segrave's camp was up over the brow of that hill there that we've just been to. So this is lower Shinbanes, and this is possibly where the 2nd camp, I believe, were pitched. Now, when they attacked that 1st camp, the element of surprise, Sir John de Segrave himself was hurt and wounded in the fighting. It would have been most terrible there. But the survivors of that raid scattered, I believe, down here, down the dip of this hill, alerting the 2nd camp, some deer running off in the distance there, alerting the 2nd camp, for those who possibly did not hear it, that an attack was underway. It's mind-boggling sometimes to think that we could be walking on top of some of the dead. I've spoken to the farmer and his hands, his farm hands, and they, at this current day, have no report of bones it being dug up, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. But we need to think about the numbers involved. Now, because the 2nd camp had been alerted, and you can just imagine some men fleeing from the carnage of that 1st attack, because many of them would have been murdered in their sleep. They would have been roused, unprepared for any hostility. But I can imagine them just running down the brow of this hill here, where we stand now, the 2nd camp being roused. There is water over there. in the dip of that wood, very much needed for horses, because these were mounted patrols. As I say, rapid response units. They'd made camp here, and their intention was to go north. They were intercepted by Comyn and Fraser. But this is Shinbanes, Lower Shinbanes, and it's a fascinating name. How tradition and folklore weaves itself into a battle. Now, why I believe there were two camps here, or even if there was one camp, the Kilburn, which is down in this dip in the woodland here, they would certainly have ran for the refuge of the wood. But the Kilburn is strongly associated with the battle, and it makes sense for a camp here who's on open ground to retreat into the cover. As you can see, it's quite a steep drop down into these woods. Now, my personal belief is because these were predominantly mounted attacks, Comyn and Fraser and his men, their men may have gotten off their, some of them may have gotten off their mounts to attack the camp, or at least creep up and get there close. But I would think, being a mounted force, that they would have wanted expediency in these attacks, certainly to get very quickly, to use that element of surprise from one camp to another. And remember, there were 3 camps here. Myth and folklore would have us believe that the Kilburn ran red with blood for 3 days. If you look at any battle in history involving water, involving a river or a stream, it always runs red with blood for 3 days. Why not 1 day? Why not 2? Why not a week? This is where folklore, myth and legend weave themselves into the story. This certainly, if they were pursuing the enemy down here and killing them, is absolutely no place for someone on horseback. It would be more treacherous to the attackers than it would be to those who were in flight. At this location, we are a good mile from the battle monument. Now, the 3rd camp, the 3rd battle, took place some way even further away, in a place that they called the Hewan, which incorporates another traditional name of the stinking rig. So named because tradition says that that's where the fighting was most awful, and that the bodies of the dead were heaped together and they stunk to high heaven. So that's Shinbanes fields and the Pentland Hills in the distance over there. We're just coming through the Kilburn Wood. And that farm that you see in front of you, behind that is a place known as the Hewan. So these are the first two places associated with the battle. Shinbanes Field, Lower Shinbanes Field, which takes in the woodland here, and the Kilburn. To get to the Hewan, if that is the third location of the fighting, where tradition states it is, and where it says there was some terrible fighting, obviously the English camp there are well alerted. On horseback, speed being of the essence, and considering the rough ground, I would put forward that it would take careful but constant riding, keeping a good pace, between 5 to 10 minutes. It's interesting to note, after the first encounter, when Sir John de Segrave was wounded, hurt, he was also captured. But some of the second camp would have come and engaged the Scots, for Segrave was freed at that point by his army, by the second camp. Robert Neville was also killed during the second encounter. Manton, reputedly, was killed by Fraser himself. It's said that the Scots took prisoners and horses after the first battle, but when the second camp was coming to engage, they killed the prisoners and the horses. But the only mention of this is from a man called Buchanan, who wrote in the 17th century. Something so late in the day can't positively be taken as truth. That farm over there is the one that we looked at from the other side. So we've come east, and we are now about to go on to the area known as the Hewan. It's a marvellous piece of terrain. I absolutely love it here, and I walk here regularly, but we're going to go down there into this place, and we're going to look above those trees on the far side where the third encounter is supposed to have taken place. One account mentions that this, or over that far side there, is where the killing was most dreadful due to the precipitous nature of the ground. Interestingly, there's an illustration which I'll also post at the tail end of this film, which shows Scots showering arrows down on the unfortunate English, and there's a burn at the bottom. Now the River Esk runs down the course of that wood there, but that could also be in reference to the Kilburn woods. We shall see. Quite boggy going here in parts, but in other areas it's really nice to walk. One thing's for sure, fighting did not happen, hand-to-hand combat at least, down here in this gully. It's no place for mounted men, and it's no real place either for foot soldiers. But we'll see what that far side has to offer. Now, there are two possible locations where I believe Stinking Rig could be. If Comyn and Fraser have come this way and the English camp is here, this area here is also known as Hewan Bank, but it's not the bogs, and I do favour the bogs. It's very possible that they came that way, fought with them, and threw the dead down here. But let's go and take a look at the Hewan Bog area. There are certainly some steep banks down here, and then it's such a long time ago, you know, 1303, that any number of places could refer to the Stinking Rig. But it's specifically mentioned throwing them into a bog-like area. Now, if they were camped here, or just further beyond even, Mount Marrow Farm is a way beyond that way. This is the Hewan Woods here, and the Hewan Valley, the Hewan Bank, is just beyond that. Let's go take a look at that. Now, if you positioned some people, okay, it could be a much larger force, way beyond up there from where we've come, which is a good 3/4 of a mile anyway, as the crow flies. Even if they were screaming at the top of their voice, it would be difficult for you to hear them. And that's not taking into account wind or anything like that. It's possible, but if they were camped here and Comyn and Fraser's men come towards this way and the fighting ensues, they reckon that this army, more than any of the other groups, this 3rd Brigade, were ready for them, or they were at least up and running, so they would have seen them appear, and fierce fighting ensued. The Scots did rout them. For sure, they are not going to carry the dead once the battle is over very far. And rather than bury them, when you look at the steep banks here that look down on the Hewan, this goes all the way into bog-like area. This could well be where they just threw the bodies over and they stuck to high heaven after a while, being left, that it came to be known as Stinking Rig. I spoke to a local this morning and I showed him some film of my research when I'd been down here, and he seemed to know his stuff. He was really into the history of it. He says, yeah, that's right, you've got it. That's Stinking Rig right there, and this is the place. When one talks about the precipitous nature of the ground, it's quite specific, so this certainly fits the bill. It's a fabulous area to come and just lose yourself in. As I say, 1303 is back in ancient times. It's such a long time ago. And look how steep we even are here. That's the River Esk way down there, in the Hewan bogs and bank over there. This would have been known as Stinking Rig. This is the location that I certainly favour. So the place known as the Bogs really begins here, and if you're to walk in all of this, I have many times, there are places, yes, there's firm ground, but you have to choose it, and particularly after wet weather it becomes known as Hewan's Bog. Hewan taking its name, I imagine, from the amount of men that were hewn down. Just giving you a look back up there to what it was, so you can really see when we talk about something being steep. And the dead in battles, big or small, are often not treated lightly. They're disarmed, they're declothed, they're mutilated in places. And certainly not always are they given a decent burial. So into this bog-like area here. The third encounter, and the end, the rout of the Battle of Roslin. I'm enjoying watching the buzzards soaring above up there. Always a beautiful sight. And imagine if the dead were left to pile up for any amount of time along there, over there, that they would have been fair pickings for the birds of prey. It's been on my mind some time to do something on the Battle of Roslin. I mean, I live a stone throw away from the place, and I'm glad it's been preying on my mind now for quite a few weeks, and I'm glad I've come and did it. John de Segrave would survive the Battle of Roslin. In fact, he would play quite a role in the years to come. Whether William Wallace was here or not, we really don't know. And I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other, except for the fact that this fight took place in February. In June that year, Wallace took part in raids with both Comyn and Fraser in Tannindale and as far south as Cumberland. When William Wallace was captured in 1305, he would be handed over at Carlisle to John de Segrave, and he would have the task of safely and securely bringing Wallace to London De Segrave would even read out his sentence in the court, and no doubt was one of the escorts on horseback that took him to Smithfield, where he would watch his execution. Forden and Bower give us numbers of 30,000 English soldiers and 8,000 Scots. Now, you certainly would not have had 30,000 mounted men, vastly inflated, to glorify, and why not, to glorify Scotland's win. For they did win. They routed an army in 2 or 3 separate skirmishes. But as I say, they were a rapid response unit under Segrave, Neville, Manton and Latimer. They split. Now, Forden says that they camped in a relatively straight line from one another. If survivors were able to get to the second camp and alert them, they must have been close. If the second camp heard the fighting and were roused by it, they must have been close. And speed was of the essence here for Comyn and Fraser and the Scots forces to reach the third camp and fight above the Hewan bank. Equally, they had to be close. The figures in no way detract from what the Scots achieved. They achieved something excellent, something great. And personally, I believe that the English forces collectively would have numbered somewhere in the region of 1,000 to 1,500 men. The Scots, about 1,000. When you split 1,000 up into 3, you have 300 odd soldiers in one brigade. That is a healthy and formidable force. 300 and odd. When you got 2 relatively close together, you got 700. And the Scots defeated them in what I believe were 2 very close camps. They've come here on the top of that ground behind those woods up there, and they've absolutely routed the third camp. And they've thrown the bodies down what I believe was Stinking Rig. It was not on a par with Bannockburn, where, of course we know, Barbour greatly inflated the numbers. 100,000 English against 30,000 Scots. He may be close to that number of Scots, being between 20 and 30,000. My own personal estimate is just over 20,000 Scots, and you can see my reasons why when you check out my films on Bannockburn. In the English, roughly about the same. I don't believe there was any discrepancy in numbers. If there was, it wasn't that great, a few thousand at most. But what did Roslin achieve? Well, the very next year, John Comyn would come into the peace of King Edward I. Robert the Bruce had come into the King's peace in 1302. There would be stiff penalties or conditions for those that came into Edward's peace. Edward was no fool, and one of those stipulations were that Wallace had to be delivered up to them. Edward would come north in 1304, lay siege to Stirling, and he would finally, in his mind, solve the problem in the land of Scotland, until Robert the Bruce reared his head and took up the fight in his own cause once more. What's interesting is that in 2019, a metal detector has made a great discovery, and we thought it was linked to the battle. He found, hidden in an old tree, a hoard of medieval coins going back to that time. But what we've since learned, or what I've since learned from people in the know, is that the latest coin in that hoard was 1322. Too late then to be associated with the Battle of Roslin. Roslin doesn't get the recognition it should get. It was a great psychological win for the Scots under Comyn and Fraser. I don't think Bruce would have thought anything of it. He wouldn't have thought of anything related to John Comyn. Simon Fraser, of course, he would come into the King's Peace, but again he would take up the fight with Bruce and eventually be captured and executed in London, suffering the same fate as Wallace. But Roslin deserves, if we separate the myths, the over-dramatisation, Roslin deserves to be remembered for what it was, and it's a great place to come and visit. The battle happening long before the chapel, long before the castle was built. But its very own first strike at making its mark in history. And it should be remembered as such, not for the myth, the folklore and the legend, but as a very real event where Scots forces stood up to Edward of England and won. It's been an absolute pleasure doing this film. I've thoroughly enjoyed making it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the weeks of research that I've gone into it. Before I go, I would like to introduce you to possibly 2 living witnesses of the Battle of Roslin. Meantime, if you did like this film, please like, comment, share, and please subscribe. Thank you.